You guys can have a seat. Been kind of up and down today. We'll change it up. We're going to continue with the series that we've done. If you've been here the last couple weeks, Living as One Who Is Loved. It's based on a book that's conversation between John Ortberg and Dallas Willard. And so I had an opportunity to spend some time with that book this week. Highly recommend it. It's a good, I don't know that I would call it a quick read, but it's not a real thick book, and it does a good job of kind of taking some of the really big, deep ideas that Dallas Willard speaks about in other books and kind of breaking it down into terms that someone like me can understand. But I was just thinking about like the title of the series, Living as One Who Is Loved. And I thought about what it means to be loved. And I think that if you are living as one who is loved, that you cannot fail. And I know that potentially that might sound a little millennially, if that's a word, a little participation trophy-ish. Everybody did a great job. Let's all pat you on the head and give you love. But I think, and again, I don't know this per se, this is what I think it is in my life. I think if you grew up in a household where you knew unequivocally 100% that you were loved, that when you came home after a perceived failure or after an obvious shortcoming, your parents or your parent or whoever it was that was the obvious person in your life who loved you, end of story, end of sentence, they didn't berate you. They didn't say, I told you you weren't going to do it. They didn't say, see, I'm right. They didn't say, you didn't have any business trying that or being out there anyway. Probably what happened is there was an opportunity for growth. There was an opportunity for your parent, for your grandparent, for whoever it was in your life to offer you the opportunity to grow, to say, okay, you failed a test. Did we study for 35 seconds? Did we study for 35 minutes? Did we know what the test was on? It was athletics. Did you practice? Did you know what to expect? It was something else. Did you talk to somebody who had gone through that experience before so that you knew what to expect and how to be best prepared? There were probably opportunities for that, but I would imagine that this individual, this adult more than likely in your life, because you knew that you were loved, you didn't come in and feel like after a conversation with them that you were a failure. And I think that when we read in Scripture, we read about God being the greatest, the most amazing, the perfect Father. For Father's Day this year, I got this mug, and I'm not sure if you can read it, but it says, World's Okayest Dad. And then, just not to like throw my family under the bus, in here it says, JK, you're the greatest. But when we think about us, if you have a kid or if you think about your parent, I would imagine that they did the best that they could to be the greatest dad, to be the greatest mom, and got it right a decent amount of times, but got it wrong some also. And when we think about God, when we think about being the perfect Father, He's never gotten it wrong. And when we, as followers of Christ, allow ourselves to beat ourselves up, we're missing out on what God has to offer as the perfect Father. And so when we look at our scripture today and when we talk today, living as one who is loved, you are loved more than we can even comprehend. And so I want you to kind of think of that as the framework for our talk this morning. We're going to be in Romans. Romans chapter 12. So if you are using the Pew Bible, it is page 1137. And we are going to read verse 1 and verse 2. So it's not going to be an extensive read this morning, but we're going to be in Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. And the Pew Bible that I'm reading out of, chapter 12, has a subtitle, A Living Sacrifice. Chapter 12, verse 1. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Right in verse 1, the Greek word there for urge, we've actually talked about this before. I've talked about this before, is parakleo, which is to beseech, to plead, to beg, to urge. So when you read this directive here in Romans, this is not a, hey guys, this worked well for me, maybe it'll work well for you. This is not a, if you don't have anything better to do and you're twiddling your thumbs and you're looking for something to work on, like, maybe give this a ride. This is an absolute, feel the pain as he's writing this. This is a huge deal, guys. Do this. And he gives the directive, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice in verse 1. And then the second directive, do not conform to the pattern of this world. And so when you give a directive, a good teacher should also then tell you how to implement the directive. So if I'm standing in front of a class and I give directions to my class, I need to make sure they are clear on how they are going to implement this project or how they are going to implement the directions that I just gave them. And so it says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And I think that one thing we have to be careful of, and this is in our regular life, and I think this is also in our walk with Christ, is seeing something really big and just giving up before we start. So when we think about renewing our mind, that might be something that looks really huge. When we read about love in 1 Corinthians 13, that's a really huge expectation. When we read the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 and 6, and we see Jesus' teachings, it can for us sometimes be so overwhelming that we don't even begin down the path. If you watch TV and you see commercials, they're less prevalent in August than they are in January, but there's a local gym called Planet Fitness. And Planet Fitness has what they call their judgment-free zone. And that is, at Planet Fitness, you are not allowed to come into their gym and take pictures of yourself flexing in the mirror. You are not allowed to grunt while working out. You are not allowed to drop heavy weights so as to bring attention to yourself for how big and strong you are. When people are thinking about beginning a new workout, if the person that they are watching, has been down this path for 3 years and they're ripped and they're buff and they do this for a living and they've been lifting weights since they were 11 years old, and you can look at that person and then look at yourself and say, it's not even worth me starting. I'll just eat less ice cream next week instead. So seeing the end product and seeing this big, gigantic change can be kind of overwhelming and can often prevent us from taking that first step down the path. So when we talk about renewing our mind, I don't want us to be so overwhelmed with, I have to completely change tomorrow, and just say, I'm not that bad right now. I'll just keep being not that bad for as long as I can, and we'll be okay. Because when we look at Jesus' expectations, and when he talks about what it means to be a disciple, being not that bad is not what he's looking for. And that's not what we should be striving to be, or what we should be striving to do. So we're going to look just a little bit this morning at the parts of ourselves that we need to work on changing. The parts of ourselves that when changes are made in these areas, we see a change in the whole. And let me just remind you, and Gary referenced this a little bit today, don't hear me contradict what you've been hearing Pastor Doug say and what you'll continue to hear him say and hear me say. I'm not about to spend some time this morning telling you how to work harder. Okay, all of the stuff that we're talking about today, we are doing with the leading of the Spirit and with the power of the Spirit, not magically we're just going to be able to start doing this on our own. But in Mark 12, the teachers of the law trying to get Jesus, like they often do, and they ask him about the most important commandment. And he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength, and love with all your soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. So in this portion of the book, when we talk about making changes and talking about truly becoming a disciple of Jesus, we're utilizing those pieces and those parts as a way to change our whole. So Jesus' first reference is the heart. And in the Bible, when you see reference to the heart, really for us today, you should think about that as our will. Our desire, our will to change, our will to make decisions, to go out, to do different things like that. So when you think about the heart, and we utilize this term even ourselves, my heart goes out to that person. I really wish there's something I could do. My will, I'm desiring to help that person, to pray for that person. John Ortberg calls it the executive center of yourself. But to love the Lord your God with all your heart is to have your will set, have your heart set on what is best for God. And I read that and I thought about that, and it made sense. When we talk to people who are trying to decide if they want to give their life to Christ, if they want to follow after Jesus, if they want to make a commitment to become a follower of Christ, we often say, when you do this, you're making God number one in your life. And so to have your will, to have your heart set on what is best for God makes sense with what we are asking of people and what we're asking of ourselves, is to make God number one in our life. And it sounds good, and we say it, and usually we want to do it, but living it out is where it becomes tough. Because our heart, our will, sometimes, maybe not for you, but for me, sometimes really wants to do what I want to do. And really wants to be focused on my life being aligned with what I think I should do, and my life not having difficulties, and my life being this magical, mythical experience that I think would be great for me. And then in those instances, my heart and my will is not actually set on what's best for God, it's set on what's best for me. And so I can blame that on society. I can say, well, I'm in the fallen world. I'm surrounded all the time with these things pushing on me and telling me it's all about me and all of those things. And while that's true, It's important and it's significant if I'm going to be a disciple of Christ, that this is a change that I want to make, that I want to have a will that is focused on what is best for God and not what is best for me. Doug has talked before, and this was kind of along the same lines of some of the stuff that Dallas Willard had talked about, and kind of reframing what hell is. And that hell is not so much a place where you see God throwing individuals against their will into hell, but hell is a place where God is not. And heaven is the place where God is. And those who are in heaven are unequivocally aware of the fact that they are not number one, and that they are at 100% submission, and that God is number one and is in charge. And those not in heaven are not ready to relinquish that power, and are not ready to relinquish who's in charge, because they want so badly to be in charge. They feel like they need so badly to be number one, to be the focus, to be the one that's making all the decisions, that they couldn't stand to be in a place where they were not in charge and they were not number one and they were not the focus. And so when we think about our heart, when we think about our will, it's an easy process to verbalize, but it becomes more difficult to live it out. And that's where we lean, again, on the power of the Spirit, not on our own abilities to decide today, I'm going to have my heart focused exclusively on what is best for God, because it's going to be a daily decision and maybe an hourly decision and interaction with the Spirit for that opportunity and for those prayers to drive you in that way. The second part is the mind. And so when we think about our mind, we think about our thoughts, we think about our feelings. And the mind and the heart kind of interact with each other and kind of coexist with each other. Oftentimes, what's on your heart is because of what's on your mind. And what's on your mind is because of what's in your heart. And when we think about our thoughts and our feelings, we can very easily jump to the far extreme. And we can say, I don't ever have to decide on a Monday morning, today, not going to do it. I am not going to rob a bank today. But there are things that we do have to decide on a daily basis, that we are going to do what we are supposed to do, or we are not going to do what we're supposed to do. And so we're not going to have like a share out hour on the stuff that you have to make that decision on. But we have talked about before that as followers of Christ, we've had it described as our fatal flaw. What is the thing that you know for you is going to be an issue for as long as you walk this earth? And what is the thing for you that you constantly find yourself going back to God about? And asking for intervention in that area and asking for strength in that area. And so when we look at our mind, when we look at our thoughts and our feelings, knowing that area, knowing what it is that fouls us up, that trips us up the most often, that's the area that we have to make a decision on. And where we want to get, what we aspire to, is that our mind is so devoted to what is good for God, that our mind is so devoted to what God wants, we don't have to make those decisions anymore. So then it becomes like robbing a bank. You don't drive by BB&T and go, okay, not today, not today, not today. You just get to the point where you're not even having those thoughts, where those decisions are not things that you're contemplating, because your mind interacting with your heart has gotten to the point where it is so focused on what is good for God, not focused on, should I make this decision or should I not make this decision? The last thing referenced in those verses is loving our neighbors. And when we talk about loving our neighbors, I feel like for me, and maybe the same for you, or you may, think horribly of me after this conversation, but I kind of group people into two different groups. And it's like people that I want to be with and want to interact with, and those that I don't. And it's not like you're in the non-interaction group because I dislike being around you or anything. I mean, it could be people that I am ambivalent toward. It's not like these are my friends and these are my enemies, and you have to fall into one of those two categories. But when we talk about loving our neighbors, we look at the Sermon on the Mount, and we look at all the different ways that Jesus describes what it means to be a disciple, and not only, as Jesus said, love your neighbors as yourself, but in that Sermon on the Mount, he really ups it and says, love your enemies. And I don't know that I have ever really kind of thought about specifically why Jesus picked those things. Like, he could have taught his whole life. Why did he specifically pick those things for the Sermon on the Mount? Why is love your enemies one of the things that he specifically mentions? And he tells us to love our enemies because he loves our enemies. And whether you're like me and you kind of have this, dual setup of individuals, or you've got 50 different categories, or you don't have any categories at all, loving your enemies is way different from not hating your enemies. Because I'm pretty good at not hating my enemies. I don't know that I can tell you that I'm pretty good at loving my enemies. And so I think today, when I was reading back through that and kind of trying to take, when I speak, I just kind of write and type and then try to turn it into some bullet points to kind of focus me and get where I want to go. But I think even this morning, I don't know that I would call that a new learning. Maybe it's a relearning. Loving your enemies is way different from how I know that I live, and I think probably how many of us as Christ followers live. And loving your enemies is not helping them to continue to do bad things to you. So maybe that's a clarification that could be helpful for some of us. Like you're at work and somebody is lying about you, and you're getting in trouble for things that you didn't do, or for things that they said that you did that you didn't do. Like, loving them is not continuing to help them hurt you. Loving your enemies, just like we talked about with our heart, just like we talked about with mind, loving our enemies is wanting what is best for them in God's guidance. And if they're not a follower of Christ, what's best for them is to know God. And so if you have enemies, if you have people in your life who are actively working against you, Your response to love them is not to help them work against you. Your response to love them is to pray for them. Your response to love them is to reach out through the power of the Spirit to see what it is that you can pray for them for. Do they need somebody in their life who can share the love of Jesus with them? Do they need someone in their life who can help them recognize the destructive path that they're going down? It's not your job to be that person. It's your job to pray that what is best for them through God's guidance happens. And so when we're loving our neighbors, our enemies being examples of our neighbors, it takes a different heart. It takes a different mind to be able to go through that process of praying for the best for somebody who is actively working against you or actively trying to harm you in some shape, form, or fashion. But now, when we look at changing ourselves, when we look at becoming more like a disciple of Christ, now it's not this gigantic piece that we're trying to accomplish. Now we can look at our heart. Now we can look at our mind. Now we can look at our relationships. And probably for you, one of those areas is a strength. One of those areas you could probably say, I feel pretty good about this. Not that I'm at 100%, not that I'm perfect, but right now, my will, my heart is very connected to Christ. Right now, my mind is really focused on doing what is best for God. Right now, my relationships, they're at a place where I'm praying for my friends, I'm praying for my neighbors, I'm praying for my enemies. But just like there's probably an area that a strength, there's probably an area where we could use some growth. An area where we know, yeah, that's not great. Yeah, I'm really struggling. Yeah, I need the power of the Spirit to intervene in this area in my life because I'm really getting it wrong, just focused on me and my power and what I think that I can do and what I think is the right thing. So when we think about seeking after what is best for God versus seeking after what is best for us, that is the renewing of the mind. That is ensuring that what we do and how we live is different. Because as followers of Christ, we need to be different. There needs to be something about us that is odd, honestly. Like, look around. We don't want Christ followers to be like everybody else. Gary referenced earlier the significance of small groups and Bible study groups and community groups that get together, and that's the true heart of the church. The most effective, life-changing small group that has ever existed is Alcoholics Anonymous. And so in our small groups, in our community groups, in our Bible study groups, we could very easily start the same way and introduce ourselves and say, "Hi, I'm Jay. I'm a sinner." And in those groups, we have the opportunity to build each other up. And in those groups, we have the opportunity to say, "Hey, you didn't get it right yesterday, but guess what? Today's a brand new day. Today you have a fresh start. Today can be day one." And I think as believers, sometimes we need that more than anything. We need somebody in our life that we can sit down and be honest with, and sit down and open up with, and it be okay. Because we're all sinners. We're all people who know that without God sending Jesus to this earth, we wouldn't have what we have. And so having an opportunity, whether it's through a small group, through a Bible study group, through a men's group, women's group, accountability partner, there's a variety of different ways that we can grow as followers of Christ, but knowing that there's somebody that we can go to. There's somebody that can help us move in the right direction to become more like Jesus today than we were yesterday. There was a quote that I wanted to make sure that I got right. So I typed it out. It's referencing the Great Commission and talking about how for a long time in church, the success of ministry was if somebody prayed a prayer. And that prayer was crossing the finish line. And anything that happened after that, well, that's okay. If they become devoted followers of Christ, if they become great disciples, that's great. If, they're just kind of present and they show up to church once a month and they pray in front of their kids and things like that, well, they said the prayer. So, we'd rather them be more connected, but at least they said the prayer, everything's okay. And changing the expectation and changing what it means to be successful into being a disciple, into being someone who is striving to become more like Christ. And the quote says, "The goal of the Great Commission was not just to teach people what they ought to do, but it's about teaching people in such a way that they wouldn't think of doing anything else." And so I'm just going to be honest and tell you this was kind of a tough one for me, because there are areas that I feel like I have strength in, and I love to just kind of think about those areas because it makes me feel better about myself. But in studying this week and in looking through, all the different parts, there's areas where I'm just not really focused on becoming a disciple in that area. I'm focused on making the decision today to do the right thing, not allowing my heart and my mind to be transformed in such a way that I wouldn't even think that it was a decision that had to be made. And so maybe the same is with you, that there are areas where that's not a strength, where intervention is needed, whether that's with an accountability partner, whether that's with a small group, whether that's just spending more time with God. I would encourage you this morning to reflect on those areas and to be reminded of what I had to remind myself of. God's plans are better than my plans. Let's pray.